presence. The special forces is the antecedents of special forces, I think, in the Indian context is really remarkable in the sense that India, perhaps not known to many, has suffered at the hands of special force actions, starting with, if I may say so, I just remind people that it was Robert Clive's campaign against the Nawab of Arcot that really began the great colonial enterprise that ended up being the Raj in India. Now, special forces, basically because Clive went with just 30 British officers and some 150-odd people from the Chennai area, Madras presidency. In the special forces, I mean, the need for a joint forces command is in one sense just too obvious to belabor. The most immediate thing that can be said as to the need for a special forces command is that it has invariably worked in war. And indeed, when wars have started out, major wars have happened in the past, the supreme commanders have ended up grouping special forces for more efficient and effective use in terms of realizing outcomes. This happened, for instance, with Eisenhower, who after the initial years where disparate special forces like the Special Operations Executive in Britain, SAS in Britain and the SBS, and the OSS in the United States service, they were grouped together by Eisenhower in his headquarters group. So there was one controlling authority that controlled all special forces operations after the initial few years in the Second World War that begat the greatest successes in terms of special force actions. In the Southeast Asia Command, again it's not generally known that Mountbatten had the largest number of special forces under command, more than the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. It was Mountbatten and the Southeast Asia Command, headquartered in Kandy, that had a multitude of special forces working against the Axis powers. Now, with this kind of past, it is really ironic that the Great Indian Army began losing that special forces edge with independence. First of all, we demobilized 2 airborne divisions which we had in 1947. We were one of the 5 countries in the world with this power projection capability, one of the 5. We demobilized it for no better reason than that we followed the model or the example set by the British Army. This was in part because our colonels, who were ramped up to generals overnight, simply didn't have strategic sense. That's one conclusion you can come to. It's an obvious conclusion. And that's the only conclusion. Because they were unit commanders at most in the Second World War. Suddenly they are presented with the command of an army and don't realize adequately the primacy of special forces, leave alone the necessity of jointness in their use. The friction between conventional military, regular units, and special forces are well known, and this is true all over the world. Indeed, Major David Sterling, the legendary unit commander of the SAS in the desert, long-range desert group, said somewhere that he fought as many battles with the military headquarters as with the Axis powers. In other words, there's always been an ill-fitting relationship between conventional military and the special forces. It's nothing new. Now the question is whether one can work around the obvious kinds of bureaucratic hurdles and so on. When the special forces were first set up, certainly in the OSS, for instance, and it may be true as well, General Lamb perhaps will confirm otherwise, that when they were first formed, the people who were considered misfits and officers and personnel with discipline issues were decanted by regular units into the special forces. It's precisely the kind of personal initiative, risk-taking, etc., all the attributes that special forces are known for, that cannot be maintained if these come under their separate military commands. Meaning, if it's a conventional military that controls the special forces, you first of all have the real problem, as we all know, of lack of appreciation of what it is you have in terms of the instrument. This may be for bureaucratic or other reasons, or simply because you have to share the budget. In the Indian setting, I think there was the first, if I recall, and I tried to confirm it with General Lidder earlier in the day, the first attempt at trying to have some kind of a separate special forces identity and then institutionalize it was somewhere in the mid to late 80s, when then Colonel or perhaps Brigadier Rustam Nanavati, produced a proposal for branching off first para, one para, and making that the nucleus for a special forces contingent controlled by the MO Directorate, Army Headquarters. That was shot down by, or rather it didn't go very far, because the then Western Army Commander and earlier the ADGMO, Lieutenant General V.K. Nair, himself being the Commander 5 Para in the past, and being the Colonel Commandant of the Parachute Regiment, nixed it for the reason that, as he put it in his memoirs, and I've just read his memoirs that he has sent to me to read over the weekend, so it's fresh in my memory. He says that the reason I opposed it was, first of all, he trotted out the reason that because the Indian Army follows a regimental system, the question of treatment of widows and so on, well, who becomes in charge of those responsibilities? Well, okay. The second more substantive reason, at least he said, he put forward in the Army Commanders Conference at the time, was that you cannot have a separate special force, even if it's controlled by the MO Directorate, if in war, these special forces have to then adhere to command plans. Which seems reasonable. And that's precisely the reason why yesterday I brought up the subject when General Lidder mentioned that, and his very, I think, feasible proposal, it's an excellent proposal, to make the NSA the person heading a special, separate special forces grouping, command, whatever you may call it. Because any time, and the proposal, just to refresh your memories about what General Lidder said, was that in peacetime ops, whatever clandestine actions are required can be done with the NSA in command. And as soon as there's war, and mobilization for war, the special forces revert to their respective commands, theater commands or whatever, which is precisely the problem, because they go back to being treated as an adjunct to, and a tactical adjunct to, the army plans. Exactly the reason why earlier we have heard our special forces not having any strategic purpose at all in terms of the usage and utility, and in terms of outcomes. If you were to merely analyze the record of the really decisive special forces actions in the world, and there have been remarkable actions. And yesterday, again, I think General Lidder mentioned the special forces action against the Norsk Hydro in Norway to deny Hitlerite Germany the heavy water for their weapons program. That's the kind of decisive action that couldn't have been done. This was, by the way, in the latter part of the Second World War, and was managed by the headquarters group in Eisenhower's command. It's a sort of thing, I think, that confirms and reinforces the need for joint forces to be grouped under a separate command, and not play around too much with having these revert to the services, the conventional militaries, because that defeats the purpose and blunts the edge. Yesterday, the French representative mentioned coherence that really is at the heart of the matter. Special forces, whatever their provenance in terms of their service backgrounds, once they become special forces, and I'd like to call it Special Operations Command really, rather than special forces. The problem with, what you call them also matters. Special forces is now, in a sense, the term is expropriated within the conventional military usage. And therefore, it gets co-opted. I'd rather think of it as a Special Operations Forces Command and give it a slightly different identity altogether, rather than what we have been essentially playing around with over the last 40-odd years. A joint forces command ensures economy of effect, economy in the employment of resources, because there's a unitary command. It knows what it wants and what is needed for in any operation to fulfill and realize whatever missions are tasked to them. They are the best judges in terms of acquisitions, and we heard earlier some of the problems of fast-track acquisitions, etc., because of the usual bureaucratic logjam and the very normal gumming up of works that the bureaucrats are prone to do. Special Forces commands, a singular command, should that come into being, will realize, because it will have the technical expertise to design, shape their capabilities in the best manner possible, because they are used to working within terrain-specific, various resources-specific milieus. And so, to task the planning and ultimate okaying by some service headquarters or somebody else in the Ministry of Defense would, I think, again, be to undermine the utility and the effectiveness of special forces. Finally, I'll end on this score, and I said this, if I recall, also in my confidential report. Getting the best people, and yesterday I had talked on the sidelines with General Eisenberg of the Israeli forces. By procedure and norms, the Israelis, and because it's a compulsory service, every Israeli citizen has to go through military service, so they are in a very different boat than we are. But the fact of the matter is, after the fighter pilots, and because not everybody can fly or has the skills to fly, the special forces get the best talent. The third in order are the submariner, and then the land forces, etc. That perhaps the Israelis can afford and manage, because it's a forced conscript army. In terms of the Indian system, how do you best get the best talents? I think this is where I also remember stressing the reward structures. General Lambs told me yesterday evening over dinner that the SAS does not anymore, the SAS appointment does not anymore carry as much weight as it once did. I don't know what the reasons are. We didn't go too far into that. But until about 10 years ago, unless you had an SAS or an SBS posting on your record, you could not get on to general staff ranks. Or rather, you missed out on points. You could still have become a flag officer, but it would be a bit more difficult. We have to again begin thinking. Of course, in such a vast army, 1.3 million, perhaps that's not possible. But those who choose to come into special service should be amply rewarded, and that should be the incentive. Someone earlier mentioned, entrant level corporate salaries at 1 lakh or whatever. And there's also a general dismay that you hear. And Chairman, I'll end on this score. And you often hear this, that somehow the incoming manpower is not as good, etc. I tend to disagree. I disagree because the incoming officers that I find when I go to IMA and so on and so forth are perhaps even better motivated. They may not have the social graces that some of us may wish they had, but damned if they are not highly motivated, and whether it can't be used for the purposes that we need to in the military sphere. But that said, in the more material aspects of rewards and remuneration, there are special allowances, etc. And I'm not quite sure what the extent are. I should have touched base with General Pathak on this before I spoke. So maybe I'm off base here. But unless the special forces officers and men get a substantial and significant increase in their remuneration packages to add on to the motivational aspects, self-motivational aspects, because it is adventurous, because it's risk-taking, etc., etc. Some people thrive on it. It will not work. Again, from the SAS example, I'm told that generally, on average, an SAS person pulls down 2/3 more salary in terms of his remuneration package, total package, than a counterpart serving in infantry or mechanized or armor. Some such reward system and remuneration system has to be built in if you are going to attract the very motivated, risk-taking people that you want. And in some sense then, something like a joint Special Forces, Special Operations Forces Command will have enough political clout, much more than if it were merely part of an army headquarters, some small cell there working to further the SF cause, or within the Navy or within the Air Force. And to have these all amalgamated with their separate skill sets. And one last thing I should mention, I looked at the skill sets, and this is in the public domain of the United States. We don't quite reveal everything of our special forces, so I won't say much. But in the US Special Forces scheme of things, there are almost as many as 120 skill sets. And I was doing a rough arithmetic on the kind of skill sets we have. And I'm afraid, without going into numbers, they are a lot fewer. This, I think, hurts the versatility of special forces, which is one of its hallmarks, because you can only cross-train in so many disciplines. You cannot go through the whole 120 odd, assuming that's the maximum figure one tries to ideally aim at achieving. This again is something a Special Forces Command, a separate Special Operations Forces Command, would help realize.
We are all very well updated, rather saturated with various issues confronting special forces. And most of the aspects which I'm going to speak have already been covered. It will be my endeavor to crystallize on those aspects and bring some specific issues, put some specific issues in front of you. I'll try to bring out in front of this august audience certain aspects which the Indian Defence Special Forces are presently faced with and recommend measures for effective management of SF training and HR policies in the services. The scope of my talk is as flashed. It will include a little bit of overview, then areas of concern for the SF training and HR issues, then coming to training management, human resource management, recommendations, and finally I'll be concluding. It is said that those who do not learn from the past mistakes are doomed to repeat them. The present state of management of training and HR issues of the special forces in the three services can be equated to the state of US Special Forces in early 1980s. I want to re-emphasize on this. Our present state can be equated to the state of US Special Forces in the early 1980s. Because of the failure of hostage rescue mission from Iran in 1980 and unnecessary casualties suffered during Operation Urgent Fury in Grenada in 1983, then Defense Secretary Mr. Weinberger and Mr. Noel Coe, a Pentagon official, had turned the heat on service headquarters to revitalize their special forces. However, from the start of the SF revitalization program, the services headquarters were not fully behind the effort. With few opportunities for the SF to convince the military skeptics of their worth, revitalization continued to lurch forward. For Noel Coe, the job of persuading the military to carry out the policies of the administration and had proved lonely and frustrating. He found himself unable to force the powerful bureaucracy in the Pentagon to move at anything like the speed demanded by Mr. Weinberger. Mr. Coe, during his testimony before the Appropriations Committee on 10th April 1984, had stated, human nature resists change, and the case at hand is no exception. And of course, when defense policy changes, defense budgets also change. And anytime one reallocates resources, vested interests and status quo are challenged. Coe went on to set out 4 main areas of concern that were still unresolved, even after 4 years of this revitalization effort. And these areas of concern were, as special forces will be among the first to be sent to war, they have to be at constant high state of readiness. Yet, he pointed out, the strength of Army Special Forces groups was 12% below authorized wartime requirements. Also, although all groups should have been at the highest readiness, in fact, to ensure that SF's training reaches desired levels, standards were lowered, thus artificially improving the ratings. Special forces typically require small quantities of specialist equipment, not in service with other units. The procurement system was not capable of handling such items, and flow of the new equipment to the special forces was very low. For example, in perhaps extreme case of the PRC-70 radio, it took 17 years from the day it was ordered for it to be delivered to the special forces for which it was intended. By that time, it was already some 10 years out of date. Like we have discussed, our experience till now hasn't been, very good either. Another important area of concern was in the early days of the Green Berets, many recruits came from Eastern European countries that had been taken over by the communists. It was common for each alpha team to have half the team fluent in another language, often their mother tongue. However, that source of recruits dried up in 1984. The predominant language other than English was Spanish, but in the regions of the third world in which other languages predominate, US could deploy no more than one fully language qualified 12-man special forces detachment to defend its interests. Well, our special forces also need to build up on this very important capability. Special forces have traditionally been the graveyard for service career. In the past, no officer with a career in the special forces have been promoted beyond brigadier, and even that rank is very rare. In consequence, ambitious officers stay in special forces for only a short time. Coe told the committee, if we are to attract and retain the highly qualified personnel we need for special operations, their career opportunities must be comparable to those of their peers in other branches of military service. As mentioned by General Katoch yesterday, there are 4 cardinal universal truths as far as effective management of training and HR assets of special forces is concerned. From the previous US Special Forces example, which I have just highlighted, and as we go along with the presentation, it will be evidently clear why they are so important. Coming to training management. Firstly, in our haste to build up adequate special forces, para battalions have been converted to para SF battalions. In my view, it would have resulted to compromising of standards. Special forces are not, made by converting people. They are made by raising people right from beginning. Their psyche has to be different. They have to be molded in certain ways. Conventional battalions cannot be just converted into special forces battalions. It needs to be understood that special forces cannot be mass produced like conventional forces. Any rapid expansion of SF would almost certainly undermine this proven selection and training process. The SF community would be forced to cut corners and lower standards in order to produce more SF personnel. The results would be degraded operational capability and, tragically, a greater probability of mission failure and lost lives. And while we might garner a certain sense of satisfaction with more special forces teams on our books, it would be hollow one at best. In the mid-1960s, the 22 SAS had to ward off pressures of their being subsumed by para regiment. In 1987, a wartime SAS veteran, Colonel David Sutherland, published a paper stating that they, the para officers, began a series of maneuvers to group 22 SAS with the parachute regiment in some form of general airborne formation in which, by some force of numbers, they would be predominant partners. Coming to the next main thing, most of the professional forces in the world are capable and are achieving their desired results because they have been very selective about the type of individuals they bring into these organizations. After the initial screening, during which a undertainee's self-discipline, motivation, physical and mental toughness, sharpness of mind and observation powers are tested, emphasis is laid on skill development to enable his flexibility of employment in small teams for varied tasks under different environmental conditions. On an average, the attrition rate of selection of special forces world over hovers around 70%, with yet another 10 to 15% of the balance lost in the ensuing special forces qualification. This is not attrition for attrition's sake. In fact, the trainees are not harassed, hazed, or otherwise coerced into quitting at any time. Rather, the physical and mental rigors of the training cull out those who do not possess the necessary attributes for service in special forces. The end result is SF personnel who are tough, self-reliant, innovative, and flexible. In his study of military elites, Roger Beaumont argues that special forces tend to suffer from what he calls the selection-destruction cycle. The most able volunteers are selected for most hazardous tasks and suffer casualties more than other units as a result. The third truth is that recruiting and training special forces personnel is a time-consuming process. It invariably takes about 3 years to get a special forces recruit up to basic level of competence, and then another few years in the field before such men are ready for anything serious. Each member of SF is expected to be competent in wide range of skills such as small arms, fieldcraft, demolition, communication, navigation, first aid, unarmed combat, and survival techniques.